Hello, I'm glad to have you back. I'm sorry we are a little bit late. We were sitting here chatting and forgot about the time. I'm very sorry. Let's see. We'll first have questions and some discussion of the homework. Okay? Thank you for your writing samples. Several of you wrote paragraphs about full human responsibility, and I enjoyed reading them very much. But first I will just go through the emails in the order they came, and I will not read your paragraphs, but we'll talk about them. Okay? Let's see. First question. Where is it? Oh, the first question, this is the only question about homeschooling. Very short question, and then we'll forget that topic for this week. The first question is, how traditional is homeschooling? In other words, what kind of family homeschools? Rich, poor, East Coast or West Coast? What type of family homeschools? This student had a friend who stayed in the United States for 6 months and never heard of homeschooling. So he thinks maybe it is not widespread. I think homeschooling is about 1% of the population at this time. That is a very high number traditionally for homeschooling. 20 years ago, it was a very, very small number of people, but it has grown exponentially in the last 20 years because of the amazing results that homeschool children get on tests. Homeschool children score very high on tests, and people began to notice, and then the law began to change. It was illegal 20 years ago. Now it is legal in all 50 states, and it is strong and thriving everywhere. Poor people and rich people homeschool pretty equally. Also, those who have higher education, college grads, parents who have college degrees, or parents who haven't even finished high school, they all homeschool, and their children all achieve high results. So these days, almost everyone in America has met a homeschooler. There are homeschoolers everywhere right now in America. But this is a recent development. 20 years ago, it was illegal everywhere. Okay, second question has to do with the Levis book. On page 20, we have a sentence which says, this is page 20, in the middle paragraph, middle of the page, right about here in the page, it says, for the problems, decidedly in the plural here, that present themselves, ... The question is, why does the author begin with the word for? For the problems. Why did he not just begin with the problems, decidedly in the plural? What is the purpose of for? For means because. and it refers back to something which was stated earlier. So when you see for at the beginning of a phrase or a sentence, you must identify what previously stated does it refer to. And in this case, it refers to the sentence before, where it says, "There will be no neat and final account of the distinctive discipline, because the problems ... So the word for means because, but we use for in the beginning. It's a little bit more formal. So this means because, and the problems ... gives the cause of why we will not have a neat and final account of the distinctive discipline. So that's the function of the word for in that sentence. The same student writes another question saying, same paragraph, page 20, toward the bottom, it says, by slipping in after ends that brief parenthetic phrase, I meant to intimate that what one for this, for that, or the other directing purpose necessarily emphasizes as an end in view gets its full significance from a totality of apprehension and concern, and that the complex totality is a vital unity. The question is, the student thought that vital unity referred to the total apprehension of one person's thoughts and experiences. However, the student thought that didn't quite work with the next sentence. And I agree. The vital unity is not individual. It connects the individual to a totality of knowledge and experience in a continuum from the beginning of time until now. The vital unity is more all-encompassing. It is not just one individual. The individual connects to the total unity in order to participate in the community of ideas which represents the living principle. Okay, let's see, what else? Okay, here is a student who has been learning English from listening to rock music, such as Elvis Presley, Grand Funk Railroad, and other American bands, and reading the lyrics. And he asks what I think about that way of learning. I think that every exposure to English is good. I think that the more English goes in your ear and across your brain, the more you will know. So I think that listening to music and reading lyrics is good. However, obviously, that is limited. You will probably never gain a full usage of English with only that. However, that is a good thing to do, a good start. Also, he mentions that doing this class is helping him to read philosophical texts, and I think that will help a very great deal. Also, trying to write the homework. If I give homework, making an attempt will be a big help. Because if you try to write in English, it will force you to bring everything you've got onto the table. And also to search for more in dictionaries, online, wherever you can find it. So I think every opportunity to be exposed through listening and through using the language, all of it is good. That's my opinion. Okay. Now, I wanted to speak a little bit about the homework. We were asked to write about a phrase which was in the book. The book said, let me see if I can find it. Hold on. Okay, on page 21, top of the page, Levis writes that the kind of thought we are speaking of involves a consciousness of one's full human responsibility. A consciousness of one's full human responsibility. And purpose. It occurred to me during class that if we were supposed to have a consciousness, that means we have our focus on this thing. We are aware of this thing. If we must be aware of our full human responsibility, it might be a good idea for us to, as an exercise, try to define what full human responsibility means. So, several of you wrote definitions and emailed them in, and I very much enjoyed reading them. They were very interesting. I had hoped to use some of your writing as exercises on the board to talk about grammar and spelling and punctuation. But when I read your writing, I felt that you had thought very deeply and had shared, in many cases, from your heart. And I do not want to criticize as though it were a literary piece, something which came from the heart. So I will not put any on the board. However, I will read to you the one that Olavo wrote. Olavo and I used this homework in our private class where I meet with Olavo, and each of us wrote our own ideas of what full human responsibility is, and then we exchanged papers and criticized each other's and fixed them up, and Olavo's is now perfect. And I really like Olavo's. And so I'll read you Olavo's. And I'll also read you mine. And I'll tell you in general what some of you all have said. So that will give you some ideas of what other students think. So first I will tell you what some students said, then I'll read you mine, and then we'll end with Olavo's. Okay? Let's see. And this is not all of them. I have some that I haven't even gotten through yet. But let's see. One person of the student body wrote that his full human responsibility began, in fact, several of you wrote, began with paying your own bills, paying your way, taking care of your family. I appreciated that because I personally believe that if a man does not take care of his own family, but maybe he lets someone take care of him while he studies philosophy, I don't think that is fully responsible. So I really appreciated the ones that spoke of our daily responsibilities as something to be considered. So that was one thing. Some, especially one, wrote very humorous, very funny. One person said that as he reads books, he only understands 10%, which means 90% he does not understand. So every time he reads a book, he adds 10% to his knowledge, and 90% to his ignorance. So his responsibility was to keep increasing his ignorance as rapidly as possible so as to make small gains in knowledge. In other words, to keep studying. And I appreciated that a lot. I thought that was very funny. Let's see. Several mentioned following the Lord Jesus Christ and spreading his love. And I deeply agree. I deeply agree with that myself. Let's see. And there was definitely a sense that philosophical pursuit, in other words, study and meditation on philosophy, helped a person to live into his full human responsibility. I will read you mine. Now, I want to explain one thing about writing. Now, Olavo and I had a discussion about this because Olavo says that when you write about philosophy, you don't need to do what I am about to tell you. And maybe he is right. But if you go to English University, you need to do what I'm going to tell you now. And that is have an outline. So let me explain, before I read you mine, about outlining. When we write for an English audience, each paragraph must have one thesis. That is one main point. And then every sentence in the paragraph must support the thesis. We call this style topic and support. I'll just write this, topic and support. So every sentence must support the one key idea, which is often stated in the first sentence, but not always, and it is repeated in the last sentence, often, but not always. And the middle sentences all support the main idea. Each paragraph is structured in this way if you want to write for English audiences, unless you're writing philosophy. And then that doesn't hold true, according to Olavo. And maybe he's right. Probably he is right. He knows about philosophy. But my thesis was, and is, that full human responsibility, I'll abbreviate it FHR, that's full human responsibility, is to channel the character of God in the world. Channel, you know how you have a river and it sticks to a channel? To channel a spirit is to provide a route for the spirit to go from heaven into the world. People talk about channeling spirits. If they are a medium and the spirit speaks through them, they are channeling spirits. So we can be a channel of God's Spirit. And then I had 3 points. Often in English we like to have 3 points. One of them was we are images of God and we are stewards of His creation. The second was we must grow into His image because we are imperfect. Sorry, I'm making it very small. And third, we must bring His image into our own sphere. We must means should. We should bring His image into our sphere. And then the conclusion simply restated this. So let me read you mine. Okay, this is my paragraph, and it fleshes out the outline. The outline is the skeleton, but the words add the flesh. Okay? Full human responsibility. Human beings, alone in creation, are made in the image of God. Likewise, we alone have been charged by God to be His representatives and stewards over all He has created. Our full responsibility involves growing into and perfecting His values and purposes, His character on earth as it is in heaven. Collectively, as a species, we rule over every aspect of creation. Individually, we wield influence in our own sphere. The housewife controls her home and raises her children to love and serve the Lord. A businessman serves the public with divine integrity. The emperor rules the masses in the same way. Full human responsibility is to incarnate and embody the priorities and character of the Creator as faithfully as possible in whatever context we find ourselves in. So that was mine. And I will read you Olavo's. I think you will recognize Olavo's ideas because when I read this to my family and his son was there, Pedro said, "I've heard that 1,000,000 times." So, but he said, but not in English. So this is Olavo's ideas in English. Okay. This is all written by Olavo, but we did perfect it in his class. Because a man has memory and consciousness, he can tell himself his own story. If he habitually lies to himself, he loses the thread of his story, and then he is lost, as in a nightmare. Full human responsibility is to tell yourself your story faithfully, which means to acknowledge yourself as the author of your acts and as the real and only cause of their consequences. When you tell yourself your own story, you are telling it to an inner listener that can falsify it in his own turn. So, you cannot be sure your story is genuine unless there is mutual trust between yourself as teller and yourself as listener. This double commitment to truth is greater than both the teller and the listener. It lies at the very root of one's unity as a person. This unity comes from the origin of all unity, that is, the total unity of existence itself, or, in religious terms, from God. You can only be fully responsible for your inner truth if you tell your story to God. I love that. I absolutely love that. In fact, after we finished writing this, we just talked about it the rest of the time. So we had no more class that night, just talking about this, because I love that. Well, let us get to our book. All right, let's see. Where are we? Okay, we are on page 21. First full paragraph. That means that one, not this, that one. First full paragraph. I will read, I think I will read, let's see. I think I'll read the whole paragraph for fluency. You will not understand most of it, but those of you who are the best in English will understand more. And then we will go to the beginning and do sentence by sentence and phrase by phrase. But first we will read to get the whole idea of the paragraph. So just relax and listen and don't struggle to understand. Try to let the ideas come in like clouds that come on a cloudy day, they fly across. Don't try to make ideas come. Just allow impressions to occur to you. Not too many impressions. Some of you will understand very little. I myself did not understand this for a long time, so it's hard. I'll read the whole paragraph. What we have to get recognition for is that major creative writers are concerned with thought, and such recognition entails the realization that the thought is of an essential kind. In relation to those who, having power in Cambridge English, may be called those responsible, I found myself very much alone. In fact, to insist on raising the problems I have pointed to and keeping them by discussion and exploratory practice exposed as problems was, it had to be recognized, an insufferable offense, one that deserved all the possible, not grossly scandalous, rigors of discouragement. And scandalousness is a matter of reigning convention. Yet, as I have recorded in the introduction to my published Clark lectures, the English Tripos had started very promisingly. I also record there that when the faculty structure was set up in 1927, the natural ward bosses, who were well prepared to take their opportunities, took them and had a rapid triumph that was almost complete. I refer again to that history as I know it because of its significance for my theme. The promise of the start was accidental. The hostility that killed the promise gives us the academic ethos we must count on. And the spirit that, miracles aside, will be strong in the use of institutional machinery, of the influence, and of the power. Here we have one of the considerations that determine the attitude that, in the following pages, I must assume as the right one, a non-acceptance of defeat that is as far from optimism as a positive attitude can be and remain undespairing. Okay, let us go back. Let me erase the board while you think about what I just read. And if you have questions, you can chat them to Alessandro and Isabella. I think she might be on, and they'll give them to me. But I'll begin with the first sentence. Now, one thing I noticed when I started to prepare for today was that the first sentence is almost exactly the same as the first sentence of the paragraph on page 20 that we did last time. The first sentence says, what we have to get recognition for is that major creative writers are concerned with thought, and such recognition ... And on the previous page, he says, what we have to get essential recognition for is that major creative writers are concerned with a necessary kind of thought. I think we must assume that this concept is very important. The idea that creative writers are concerned with a necessary and essential kind of thought, without which humanity begins to be dumbed down. If we do not develop the higher thinking in humanity, humanity will sink. And Levis is screaming. He is speaking loudly. He is emphasizing that we must gain recognition, which means the people must admit and realize that the study of literature, the study of the creative writing, is what develops higher thinking so that we can be fully human. So, he says, we have to get recognition, which means the people out there need to realize it and admit that major creative writers are concerned with thought. And such recognition entails the realization that the thought is of an essential kind. Now, the word entails means contains. So, if they recognize what we want them to recognize. At the same time, they will also be recognizing that the thought is of an essential kind. So when we gain recognition that major creative writers are concerned with thought, we will also gain recognition that the thought is of an essential kind, not just any old thought. Okay. In relation to those who, having power in Cambridge English, may be called responsible. Okay. In relation to means he is about to speak about these people. He has something to say which will pertain to them. Those who have power in Cambridge English. Who has power in Cambridge English? It is the professors, the faculty. They are the ones who are making decisions in Cambridge English, in the Department of English at Cambridge. When he says, in relation to those who, having power in Cambridge English, may be called responsible, this is an insult. To call them responsible is to give them honor. If you say they are responsible, you are saying something good. He does not want to say they are responsible, even though they have power. To be responsible means to have power and to use it well. He concedes they have power, and in that sense they are responsible. But only in that sense. They are not using it well. We can tell from his tone in when he says, in relation to those who, having power, may be called responsible. He is separating out the using it well from the having power as an insult. Okay? Because responsible, full human responsibility, it means to do what you are supposed to do. They are not. Okay. So, in relation to these people, I found myself very much alone. So, what he is saying is, he is a professor, they are professors. However, all of those who shared power with him, he had some power. All of those colleagues were those who had power but were not behaving responsibly. He found himself very much alone from them. Okay? In fact means more information. There is more coming. In fact, to insist on raising the problems I have pointed to. When you use the word insist, that means to push your will onto someone against their will. It is sort of gentle and sort of respectful, but it is a use of force. So when he would insist on raising these points of the importance of English and the importance of critical thinking, when he uses the word to insist, it means that they were disagreeing and he was pushing his point. So you see that it was not just a discussion. He was pushing his point. So to insist on raising the problems I have pointed to and keeping them by discussion and exploratory practice exposed as problems. Okay, so what he's saying is that in the community of professors, when he would insist that there was a problem, and then keep on insisting with more and more discussion, more and more experiments to prove it. This was offensive to them. Okay? Okay, so by insist on raising the problems I have pointed to and keeping the problems by discussion and exploratory practice exposed as problems, it had to be recognized, an insufferable offense. Okay, so to them it was insufferable. They would not put up with it. They hated it. They wanted him to be quiet, and he refused to be quiet. He kept bringing up the problems and holding them forth through discussion and demonstration. And this was a horrible offense to the power brokers of Cambridge. This was an offense which deserved all the possible, not grossly scandalous, rigors of discouragement. Okay, so he is saying the offense that he committed, the sin he committed, the bad behavior of raising these problems, deserved punishment from them. He doesn't mean this literally. This is a figurative and ironic way of saying that from their perspective, his offensive behavior deserved terrible censure, terrible punishment, the most severe punishment to discourage him from continuing that they possibly could inflict without causing a scandal. To cause a scandal means to do something wrong themselves. So they wanted to discourage him from continuing to raise these problems. They wanted to discourage him as effectively as possible without doing anything criminal. They didn't want to kill him or assassinate him or tell lies about him so that discredit him in a way that would reflect badly on themselves. They didn't want any scandal. They wanted to see themselves as gentlemen. But they did want to shut him up. So they exposed him to the rigors of discouragement, the punishment, as severe as possible without being scandalous. And who defines scandalous? They do. They are the ones who decide what is scandalous. So when it says, and scandalousness is a matter of reigning convention. Convention means whatever the majority is doing is conventional, it is normal, and it is acceptable, it is legitimate. So their behavior was the definition of acceptable. So this is actually a very, yes. Okay, technical problem. All right, we're going to restart and come right back. Stay tuned. Okay. We are in the sentence that says, in fact, on page 21, to insist on raising the problems I have pointed to and keeping them by discussion and exploratory practice exposed as problems, it had to be recognized an insufferable offense, one that deserved all the possible, not grossly scandalous. Grossly means extremely and very obviously scandalous rigors of discouragement. And scandalousness is a matter of reigning convention. I was going to tell you that this whole sentence is very clever and very almost funny and sarcastic. His meaning is that by continuing to raise these problems, he is offending the majority, and the majority becomes his enemy. And the majority wants to shut him up in any way which will not involve them in overt misdeed. However, they themselves are the ones who decide what is misdeed and what is acceptable action. They are the kings of the reigning convention. Convention just means what everybody does is conventional, and they are everybody. So, he is to be exposed to rigors of discouragement, which is really forms of punishment, to discourage him from speaking up. Moving on. Yet. And yet usually means something contrary. Since he is now being discouraged, I think the yet suggests maybe he will be expressing something encouraging now, or expressing a refusal to be discouraged. Yet means something different. Okay, yet. As I have recorded in the introduction to my published Clark lectures, the English Tripos started very promisingly. For those of you who don't remember, English Tripos is a set of examinations that were cumulative. At the end of your study of English, you have to write papers, and that was called the Tripos. They would have them in other subjects as well. And one of the papers that the students always had to write in their English examinations was on practical criticism, judgment and analysis. Okay, so the English Tripos had started very promisingly. Promisingly means with a promise of good things in the future. So promising means we are encouraged. This is going well and will probably be better in the future. Even better. So that's what promising means. It's future looking with optimism. So, the English Tripos began in the beginning very well. I also record in the Clark lectures that when the faculty structure was set up in 1927, faculty structure. Faculty means teachers. The group of teachers is the faculty of the college. So when the faculty structure was set up, that means when they appointed certain professors to be in charge of the English Tripos in 1927. The natural ward bosses. I am not completely sure what ward bosses meant to Levis, but in my day in America, ward bosses has a negative connotation. It sounds almost like mafia, organized crime, people who are in charge of small neighborhoods or local cities in almost a criminal way would be the ward bosses. You think of Al Capone. He's an American gangster. People like that were the ward bosses in American history. And I wouldn't be surprised if Levis is suggesting that these faculty power brokers were functioning like criminal ward bosses over the English department. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what he means, but I'm not completely sure. Anyway, they were the natural ward bosses because they were the faculty. They were the professors who were in charge of the program. So anyway, I record here that when the faculty structure was set up in 1927, the natural ward bosses, who were well prepared to take their opportunities, took them, and had a rapid triumph that was almost complete. Okay, these ward bosses were prepared to take their opportunities. We've spoken before of taking your opportunity as meaning rushing in and grabbing what you can grab in a moment of time, because your opportunity will close soon. So they took their opportunity to turn the program in a different direction, and their triumph was almost complete. They were very successful in taking a promising program and turning it into a different channel. Okay? So, they were well prepared to take their opportunities, took them, and had a rapid triumph that was almost complete. So they were almost completely successful in derailing the promising English program that had originally been set up. I refer again to that history as I know it because of its significance for my theme. His theme is that we need to cultivate a certain kind of intelligence by means of training students in critical reading of literature, but this isn't happening in the schools as they are now. Okay, so that history is very relevant to his theme. Okay, the promise of the start was accidental. The hostility that killed the promise gives us the academic ethos we must count on. Accidental usually means by chance. It just so happened. Nobody tried to make it this way. I think he is saying that the promising start was natural. It was the natural outflow of the living principle. We have had an unbroken continuity of intelligent thought for centuries, for millennia in the human race. And it didn't take much for students in the 1910s and the 1920s in Cambridge, which was an elite university. It wasn't difficult for them to do well and add to the store of literary thought. That could be accidental. It wasn't the result of design. It wasn't Levis who made this happen. He probably couldn't have stopped it. It was the normal living principle. So the promising start was accidental. But the hostility that killed it, that turned it from its natural course of upward growth into the dumbing down that they have now, that was not accidental. That was ingenious and took ingenuity. That took a concerted, collaborative effort on the part of the ward bosses and the others who were power brokers in Cambridge English. So there's a contrast between accidental promise and intentional derailing of a promising start. So, the promise of the start was accidental. The hostility, and you understand hostility means malice. The hostility that killed the promise, which strong terms, killed the promise, cut it off completely, gives us the academic ethos we must count on. Ethos means environment of thought. The academic ethos means the climate on the college campus. When you go to the campus and you sit in on classes, lectures, listen to the students as they speak to one another, you get a certain feel for where they are at. That is the ethos. The academic ethos that we must count on is hostile to the living principle. It is hostile to the natural growth and development of higher critical thought and of deep, wise human reflection. In fact, it's hostile to the development of the ability to think on a higher level. So, it says we must count on this ethos. To count on something is to rely on it. It's like to say, I know in the future this will be the situation. I am counting on it. I know it will be this way, therefore I will act in accordance with what I know the conditions will be in the future. So when he says the hostility which killed the promise of the good start, the promising start, the hostility gives us the academic ethos which we must count on. So we know the academic ethos is going to be hostile to us. We know that, therefore we must plan our strategy accordingly. And the spirit that, miracles aside, will be strong in the use of institutional machinery of the influence and the power. Okay, this I've lost the thread of the sentence because of its significance. The promise of the start was accidental. The hostility that killed the promise gives us the academic ethos and the spirit that will be strong in the use of machinery, influence, and power. Okay, this is the core of the sentence. Okay, I refer to the history as I know it because of its significance for my theme. The promise was accidental. Okay, the hostility that kills the promise. So hostility is the subject. Hostility gives us the ethos, right? All right, gives us the ethos, and it gives us the spirit, which is a bad spirit, by the way. It exposes us to the spirit, which will, miracles aside, be strong in the use of power. Be strong in the use, okay, gives us the bad ethos and gives us the spirit which will use institutional machinery influence and power. Okay, so the hostility gives us the negative ethos which we will count on, and the hostility gives us a spirit, a bad spirit, which will definitely use the institutional machinery. So institutional machinery is all of the rules and regulations of Cambridge, which give them power. such as giving tenure to the professors, or giving out lectures, or giving a good schedule, or giving office space. Whatever the institution can do to encourage or discourage will be used against us. Also, any influence that can be used against us will be used against us. And any power which can be brought to bear will be brought to bear. So, this sentence, it's a complicated sentence, but that is the thread of it. All right, so I refer again to that history as I know it because of its significance for my theme. The promise of the start was accidental. The hostility, not accidental, the intentional hostility that killed the promise gives us the academic ethos that we must count upon, and gives us the spirit which, miracles aside, will be strong in the use of institutional machinery against us, strong in the use of influence and of power. Here we have one of the considerations that determine the attitude that, in the following pages, I assume as the right one. A non-acceptance of defeat, that is as far from optimism as a positive attitude can be, and remain undespairing. Okay, when he says here, he is referring to this. Okay? In the fact that they are going to be against us, using power, influence, and the full power of Cambridge. In light of that, that's what here means. In light of all this, we determine what attitude we should take. He determines what attitude he will take in the following pages, and he defines it for us here. The attitude that he will adopt in these pages and that we should adopt is a non-acceptance of defeat. Okay, so let's write that down. Non-acceptance of defeat. Non-acceptance of defeat. Now, on the surface of non-acceptance of defeat, you have a picture of an army of soldiers struggling and refusing to be overcome. If they won't accept defeat, they are not victorious. They are not the conquering army. This is not glorious. This is, I am holding on by my fingernails. I refuse to accept defeat. I will fight to the last man and all die before I will accept defeat. So this is strong in the sense that it is resolute, but it is not strong in its position. Okay, so he is saying we are overwhelmed. The institutional machinery is against us. The academic ethos everywhere is against us. The power and influence are against us. But will we give up? No. We will not accept defeat. Okay? So the correct attitude is a non-acceptance of defeat. That is as far from optimism as a positive attitude can be and remain undespairing. Okay, so this is not optimistic. Optimism means hope. Optimism looks to the future and expects something good. Despair is over here. Okay? Despair gives up. So, he is saying our non-acceptance of defeat is as far away from optimism as it can possibly be, stopping short of despair. We are 1 inch from despair. Despair is negative. Optimism is positive. Now you can be very positive all the way over here, joyously positive. Or you could be a little bit less positive, a little bit less, maybe a little nervous, maybe a little apprehensive, maybe beginning to wonder if we can really win this war, but not quite ready to give up. Well, our non-acceptance is as far over in this direction as it can possibly be without crossing over into despair. So, this is what Levis believes is the correct attitude for us. We are fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds, but it is not the same as no hope at all. Some good can be done. The life in mankind can be suppressed, but maybe not killed altogether. And if we do not succeed, we can always die trying. And maybe the next guy will succeed. So, Levis says our attitude is to refuse to accept defeat, but to be as far from optimism as possible without falling into despair. So, I thought that was a pretty smart way, very intelligent way of describing the attitude. I am more and more impressed with Levis's writing as we read further. It's very clear what he's saying. Okay, so that is the end of that paragraph. Next paragraph. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to email them or chat them. I can now go on to say that not everything in that early history simply and merely lends itself to the case for pessimism, even though to adduce the conditions out of which scrutiny grew, for scrutiny really was, though to say it once was bad form, an achievement of the old Cambridge, is to emphasize the rapid change that eliminated them. It was a vanishing Cambridge that scrutiny stood for, and the 20 years' battle for survival was a battle against a new and triumphant academic institutionalism, the new kind of enemy this bred and empowered, and the whole massive movement of civilization. Yet for 20 years the life persisted, not unknown to the world at large or fruitless, and a decade after the kill, the Cambridge University put the reprinted offense into worldwide circulation. The unforgivable had become both classical and indispensable. Okay, first sentence. I can now go on to say that not everything in that early history simply and merely lends itself to the case for pessimism. Over here is pessimism. Notice I use the word optimism. The opposite of optimism is pessimism. Pessimism means believing that the future holds only bad things, believing that everything bad will come with the future. So, even though in the previous paragraph he said everything is against us, the academic ethos, the spirit of the university, all power and influence are all against us, and we are almost despairing but not accepting defeat. All of that sounds really pessimistic. It sounds very pessimistic. However, he can now go on to say that not everything in the early history simply and merely lends itself to the case for pessimism. So in other words, it wasn't all bad. History is not a story of a total kill, a total defeat of the living principle. Even though to adduce the conditions out of which scrutiny grew, to adduce means to present as evidence, to bring forward for consideration. So to present the conditions out of which scrutiny grew. You know, Scrutiny was a magazine of critical writings that the students produced and that Levis edited in the earlier days. These were samples of the kind of literary criticism that he felt was valuable and that the power brokers of Cambridge felt were unnecessary at best. Okay, so Scrutiny was a sort of countercultural in its day because it came from the old Cambridge where scholarship was valued, and it existed into a time when scholarship was no longer valued. In fact, it was discouraged. So the conditions in which scrutiny grew, they came from old Cambridge, and it lasted into the unfavorable ethos. Okay. So, to adduce the conditions out of which scrutiny grew is to emphasize the rapid change that eliminated them. Okay, so scrutiny grew in the soil of the old Cambridge. Scrutiny was the product of students who were brought up in the old system. However, if you bring forth for consideration the characteristics of the old Cambridge, you will emphasize the changes that brought about the new situation. Okay? The rapid change, the fast and furious changes which eliminated them, and the word them refers to the conditions of old Cambridge. Okay? So, it was a vanishing Cambridge, something that was disappearing, an academic ethos that favored scholarship. It was a vanishing Cambridge that scrutiny stood for. Stood for means represented. And the 20 years battle for survival, so scrutiny had to fight to survive. They were always trying to cancel it. The battle for survival was a battle against a new and triumphant academic institutionalism. When we talk about new and triumphant, you get the feeling of banners waving in the wind. You get the feeling of a successful army advancing with its flags flying high and joyful rhetoric. We have conquered. Hail the conquering hero. This new institutionalism was triumphant. It was very happy to get in. and very proud of itself and forward-thinking, supposedly. The new Cambridge saw itself as a positive, reforming, progressive force. Okay? So, scrutiny, which was a relic of old Cambridge, had to fight for existence amid this new, triumphant academic institutionalism. Institutionalism makes you think of bureaucracy. It makes you think of rules and laws and people on high making decisions that affect the group far below. So, it doesn't sound good to me. All right, so it was a battle against a new and triumphant academic institutionalism. The new kind of enemy this bred, the new kind of enemy this bred and empowered, and the whole massive movement of civilization. So, what scrutiny was standing for: the battle for survival was a battle against three things: the new academic institutionalism, and scrutiny represents the kind of scholarship that we are trying to foster. So, Scrutiny was a magazine that was part of the old Cambridge, which had to fight for survival. Fought for survival against three things. One, new academic institutionalism. Let me fix this. Institutionalism. Think about what happened in Brazil. Now, I don't know much about what happened in Brazil, but I know what happened in the United States. Early in our history, education was local. Education began with the parents and groups of parents who hired teachers and set up local schools and taught children according to classical means. Then, in the 20th century, we had the beginning of the institutional public schools that took over everything. And with the academic institutionalism, especially in the 1960s, education was destroyed in America. So in Cambridge, you had the new academic institutionalism which took over power and changed the practices of the time, tried and true practices of the old system. Okay, so scrutiny had to fight against the new academic institutionalism, the breed of enemy, a new kind of enemy that this bred. A new kind of enemy that this, meaning the academic institutionalism, bred. He doesn't specify what the new enemy is. He'll speak of that later. Your guess is as good as mine. But there is a new kind of enemy that is against a magazine like Scrutiny. And that enemy has been brought about and nurtured through this type of an institution, this type of a school, this type of an approach to education creates a whole new kind of enemy. And 3, the massive movement of civilization, the whole massive movement of civilization. Whole means everything. Massive means huge. Movement means like a wave coming in of civilization. These words are as broad as can be. He is not talking only about Cambridge. He is not talking only about a small local problem. He is talking about a movement that is national in scope, at least. In our day, it is international in scope. My personal experience in America is that the entire civilization has gone crazy. The civilization does not value wisdom and intelligence and virtue anymore in America. There has been a cretinization, a dumbing down, a debasing of the average American on a scale that is touches the entire civilization. And in the public schools, if you have 100 children, 99 of them are affected and are debased. That's why we have homeschooling in America, because we had the freedom to say no and to keep our children home and to teach them ourselves and to avoid this cretinization, this dumbing down, this depression of their ability to grow. Anyway, I identify in 21st century America with what Levis saw happening in 1975 in England, 35 years ago. This has definitely happened in the United States and probably in Brazil as well. So, according to Levis, this is what scrutiny fought against for 20 years, and that's what you and I would fight against, you especially, with your position as students of Olavo, and what I fight against in my small way as a teacher of students, small numbers of students. So, anyway. All right, so, let's see. It was a vanishing Cambridge that scrutiny stood for, and the 20 years battle for survival was a battle against a new and triumphant academic institutionalism, the new kind of enemy this bred and empowered. So the institution not only bred the enemy but gave it power. And the whole massive movement of civilization. Yet, for 20 years, the life persisted. He is identifying scrutiny with the living principle. He is identifying scrutiny with life. His theme in this book is, at least so far, is that given any chance at all, human thought will grow and will develop. It's like the seeds of the grass will push up unless you totally suppress it. So he is identifying creative thought and the study of creative literature with its concurrent growth of character, intellectual growth, spiritual growth with life. And Scrutiny was a magazine that evidenced that life. It gave an outlet for this kind of creative, critical exercise. Okay. So, for 20 years, the life persisted, not unknown to the world at large or fruitless. So it's not unknown and not fruitless. If something is unknown, its influence is restricted. If an enemy can prevent anyone from ever hearing of you, then he will neutralize your effect. So Scrutiny was not neutralized, it was known, and its seeds were spread. And because its seeds were spread, they grew, and it was not fruitless. Scrutiny got out there, and it fostered more creative criticism and bore some fruit. So, not unknown is a double negative. It means it was known. Not fruitless is a double negative. It means it had fruit. Okay, so that's a difference between English and Portuguese. For us, double negative is positive. All right, so not unknown means it is known to the world at large. Not fruitless means it had fruit. And a decade after the kill. Decade is 10 years. And the kill, means when they put Scrutiny out of business. Okay, no more Scrutiny, we're done. Scrutiny is no more. That's the kill. Okay, so when they succeeded in getting rid of Scrutiny, a decade after the kill, so 10 years after, Cambridge University Press put the reprinted offense. The offense was Scrutiny, and they reprinted it. So 10 years after it was discontinued because of hostility, Cambridge reprinted it and put it into worldwide circulation. That means they made it available to the whole world 10 years after it was canceled. Thus, there's a colon, that means thus, the unforgivable. Scrutiny was unforgivable. The offense is unforgivable. You know, we talked about how it has to be discouraged with everything not scandalous. The unforgivable, meaning Scrutiny, had become both classical and indispensable. So, when Cambridge University Press reprinted Scrutiny, they recognized that Scrutiny was classic and worthy of reprint, and also that it was indispensable. So it's like saying, history has vindicated us. History has shown that we were right. That's the idea. Okay, next paragraph. The elimination of the conditions that had made the 20 years possible certainly doesn't favor buoyant assumptions. I recognize that, though not merely that, when I set myself to explaining why this is not the book I started writing in the Scrutiny days. 20 years ago, the first reason I should probably have given for not having gone on to complete the book would have been that there was so much else to do. I had by then written a good deal of extended criticism, critiques of Shakespeare plays and of works by major novelists. I had even, in re-evaluation, tried to suggest the kind of continuity of relation there ought to be between the work done under judgment and analysis and the student's dealings with literary history. In fact, pressed further by the questioner, I might have followed up the first reason with the confession that the will to carry out the original plan was not as strong as it once had been, and that what had been growing was my sense that the proper continuation of judgment and analysis, for the kind of illustrative demonstration printed in Scrutiny could hardly be completed, was actually represented by extended criticism, of which, in great diversity, there was so much asking to be done. Okay. All right, he's back to explaining why he didn't write the book he planned to write 20 years ago. 20 years ago, he had planned to write a book about practical criticism, and he was going to call it Judgment and Analysis. And judgment and analysis was referring to a practice of careful, critical reading by amateurs, by students, by ordinary people. It was not something that had to be done by experts. It was something, or specialists. It was something that should be done by common men and women. But he never wrote that book. So he's back to talking about why not. Okay. The elimination of the conditions that had made the 20 years possible certainly doesn't favor buoyant assumptions. Buoyancy is floating, like a buoy floats on the waves. Buoyancy refers to the ability to float on water. When he talks about buoyant assumptions, he is back to his optimism-pessimism concept. Remember, we talked about optimism over here. Optimism is hope. Pessimism is despair. And in his previous paragraph, which we just studied, he talked about the proper attitude for us is to be positive here. So we are not to despair, but we are to refuse to accept defeat, realizing that our cause for optimism is not good. We do not have a good case for optimism. In fact, things look pretty bad. Okay, that's the proper attitude. Well, he says, the elimination, that means the getting rid of, remember scrutiny? They got rid of it. The elimination of conditions that would allow scrutiny to exist. So when the conditions got so bad that scrutiny was killed, that elimination does not favor buoyant assumptions. So buoyant assumptions is hope. B-U-O-Y. B-U-O-Y. That word is buoy. That's like that thing on the waves. Buoyant. Buoyant assumptions. So, when things got so bad that scrutiny couldn't exist, it did not favor buoyant assumptions. I recognize that. So he says, I know this isn't good. Though not merely that. When I set myself to explaining why this is not the book I started writing in the scrutiny days. Okay, so he's saying when I explain why I'm not writing the book I was going to write, I recognize that this was happening, okay, but more than that, there were other reasons for me not to write the scrutiny book. Here are my other reasons. 20 years ago, the first reason I should probably have given for not having gone on to complete the book would have been that there was so much else to do. So he's saying that when he did not write his book on practical criticism, judgment, and analysis, it wasn't because he understood that conditions were bad. That wasn't the main reason. His first reason was maybe there was so much else to do that his book was low priority. He didn't think it was important enough. He thought something else was more important. So he had other things that were more urgent to him. I had, by then, written a good deal of extended criticism, critiques of Shakespeare plays and works by major novelists. Okay, remember when we talk about practical criticism, which is the same as judgment and analysis. Okay, when we talk about these, we are talking about amateur writing. At this time, he had done extended criticism. Okay, so extended criticism is not amateur, this is more expert. Okay, so when he says he had gone on to do some of this, he was kind of getting away from the more elementary at the time. He was going on more to the higher level expert work. I had even in Re-Evaluation, which was another magazine, I believe, that he edited, I'm not sure, tried to suggest the kind of continuity of relation there ought to be between the work done under judgment analysis and the student's dealings with literary history. So we have spoken before about how literary knowledge and wisdom is in an unbroken tradition with continuity from millennia past through now. And the true expert not only reads a novel and gives his opinion, but the true expert connects this with something that has come before. The true expert can see influences. They can say, okay, this author obviously is relying upon this one, who was relying in turn upon this one. So the Levis was beginning to suggest that students who engage in judgment and analysis should move into connecting it to literary history, which we do need to do if we are going to be true experts and true scholars. You need to not only have a cultured taste for the modern creative writing, but also have an education which has familiarized you with what led up to it so that you can see the development. Okay, so that's what he is talking about. All right, so I had even, in Re-Evaluation, tried to suggest the kind of continuity of relationship that there ought to be between work done under judgment and analysis and the student's dealings with literary history. So he wants these things to take their place in the continuity, to join the big tree we talked about before, the living, growing, body of human wisdom and knowledge that's also rooted in written literature.
Margarita,
Yes.
2 questions about vocabulary.
Vocab.
First one, what does to get rid of mean? And second one, what does merely?
Merely?
Yeah.
Okay. 2 questions have been asked. One is, what does it mean to get rid of something? Get rid of something. It means to make it go away. When we think of getting rid of things, we might think of bugs in your house, roaches or rats. We want to get rid of them. In fact, we have a product which is called Rid. And it gets rid of pests in the house. So get rid of means to make it go away. The second question is, what does the word merely mean? Merely means only. Merely usually means simply. It means it is only this and not something more complicated. It can also mean just. I was just saying that I thought you looked good. I was only saying, I was merely saying. It means only or just. I was just doing this. Only. Okay, is that clear enough? If you have any other questions, just send them in. Okay, let's see. So, I'll go back to the sentence. I had even, in reevaluation, tried to suggest the kind of continuity of relation there ought to be between the work done under judgment and analysis and the student's dealings with literary history. In fact, so in fact means more information, pressed further by the questioner. So when someone asks you a question and you give an answer, and then they ask you the same question for more information, dig deeper, they are pressing you. So if we were to ask Levis, why didn't you write the book? He would say, there was so much else to do. I was writing about Shakespeare. Then we press him and he says, I was even writing about how the students ought to be connecting their work to history. Then you press him further. Why else didn't you write this book? Okay? I might have followed up, adding to my previous answer, followed up the first reason with the confession that the will to carry out the original plan was not as strong as it once had been. That means he was not motivated. Originally, he thought he should write a book about practical criticism. But as time went on, he didn't really want to. His will to complete it became less. And that what had been growing was my sense that the proper continuation of judgment and analysis was actually represented by extended criticism. Okay, I skipped a phrase in order to put the core of the sentence together. So, he is saying that his motivation to write a book about practical criticism became weaker because what became stronger in him was the idea that what we really need to do is get the students to move from judgment and analysis toward extended criticism. So he was more interested in exploring extended criticism in a book rather than wasting his time talking more about this, which the students were already doing. He wanted to develop judgment and analysis in the direction of extended criticism. In other words, he wanted to take students and amateurs and turn them into something more approaching an expert. And then in between, I put that sentence together, but let's take it apart again and see the parenthetical phrase. It says, let's see, what had been growing was my sense that the proper continuation of judgment and analysis, and then he says, for the kind of illustrative demonstration printed in Scrutiny could hardly be completed. Okay. What he's saying there is that what went on in Scrutiny was complete in itself. It was practical criticism happening. It was judgment and analysis happening. However, he wanted to move on toward extended criticism. So he doesn't want to say that practical criticism is completed because it was complete in and of itself. But he wants to develop the exercise further and have the students move further. Okay? So, the final phrase, he says, what was growing was my sense that the proper continuation of judgment and analysis, skip the parentheses, was actually represented by extended criticism, of which, in great diversity, there was so much asking to be done. So, what he's saying is, he wants to teach students or to move students in the direction of doing extended criticism. And there is tons of opportunity. So much asking to be done. So much creative writing to examine and relate back to its predecessors and forebears in thought. There was so much to do that who has time to write a book on practical criticism when there's so much extended criticism out there waiting to be done? So that's what he means. Okay, next paragraph. At this point, I have to invoke again the Cambridge context implicit in Scrutiny. I am not going to enlarge on it, merely to offer an immediately relevant note regarding my work as supervisor and lecturer for the English Tripos. I did my supervising as a college officer, both responsible and independent in relation to the studies of men reading English at the college. The lectures, including a course of judgment and analysis, were given to a large university audience in which most of my own undergraduates would be present, being aware of the bearing of the lectures on college supervision. This last term covers frequent meetings with students, meetings varying as to the number of students involved, college autonomy favoring flexible opportunism. Okay, so he is getting ready to explain another factor in his mental state when he decided not to write a book on practical criticism, but to work more with judgment and analysis, moving toward extended criticism. He is reminding the reader and informing the reader that at the time he was a professor in Cambridge. And when he says the Cambridge context, most of us never went to Cambridge, so we may not know what it was like. So he is going to tell us now what it was like in that context. He was a supervisor, which means he was like a tutor. He was a teacher. He was a man who supervised students. And he was a lecturer, a man who taught groups for the English tripos. So the English track, the English school. Okay. As a supervisor, he did his supervising as a college officer. He was responsible and independent in relation to the studies of men reading English at the college. So he was responsible for them, and he was independent in the sense that he had full management, full control of what was going on. The lectures that he himself gave and taught, including a course of judgment and analysis, which he taught to large audiences, were given to a large university audience in which most of my own undergraduates would be present. So in one sense you can think, why does he need to write this book? He is teaching his students in a lecture context, explaining everything. His students were all present because they were aware, they knew that it would be important to their supervision. In other words, they knew he would demand that they master his subject. They had to learn it from his lectures. Supervision. This last term covers frequent meetings with students. So he was constantly meeting with students. Meetings varying, so sometimes one thing, sometimes another, as to number of students involved. So sometimes he would meet with individual students, sometimes small groups, sometimes large classes. College autonomy favoring flexible arrangements. So the students were autonomous. The students were allowed to pursue their studies individually. And so flexibility of meeting one student here, one student there, having office hours was favored in this context. They didn't have like large classes that everybody had to attend, and that's how you interacted. Each student was doing self-study. And so he would supervise them individually and in small groups, as well as giving large lectures. So this was his context during the years when he neglected to finish his book on practical criticism. Next paragraph.
Margarita, I think we should take a break.
Okay, time for our break. If you have any questions, you can email them or send them in now. And in 5 minutes or so, we will have a few questions and then we'll be done. Okay, we have had only one question. And if you have any more questions, send them in now. Otherwise, we will finish class and be done. See you next week after this one question. Okay? The question was, are all philosophical books in English written in the same complicated, difficult style as Levis? My impression is that they are not. I am not an expert in philosophical books. However, I have read some, and they were much different than this. Also, when I studied this book before beginning this class, I read reviews of this book, And some of the reviewers commented on the difficulty of style. And they also commented on the fact that Levis speaks about things that were true in his day in Cambridge, which the general audience may not know, which makes this more difficult. It's not written for universal audience. So I would say that many books on philosophy will not be written like this. The reason we chose this book was because it contains information which is very important to Olavo that you all be familiar with. So, good news, they're not all like this. Okay, if you don't have any other questions, we'll sign off. And if you have anything you'd like to talk about next week, you can email during the week to me in English or Portuguese, and we'll bring them up next week. Aside from that, see you in 1 week. Bye.